Hello, and today we're going to walk through the pre-war great powers of Europe. As we begin here, I want to make sure you are 100% comfortable with this map. If you are not, definitely get in and study it. You need to know where these countries are in relation to each other. You need to be familiar with Germany being sandwiched in between France and Russia. You need to know that Belgium is kind of sandwiched itself in between Germany and France. You need to know the relationship of Austria-Hungary to Serbia, and so definitely be sure to study this map and be as familiar as you can with it. But as we make our way through these great powers of Europe, we want to start with what are known as the Big Five. We're talking Great Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. Know those countries as the major players on the European continent. We will start with Great Britain. This was the most liberal and the wealthiest of the European powers. And I want to call a quick timeout on that word liberal, because obviously we hear this a lot in modern American politics. When we say liberal in this class at this time, we are talking about liberal in terms of giving political rights to more people, essentially having more people with rights to vote and elect representatives for themselves. So Great Britain is, even though it's a monarchy, it's a constitutional monarchy. There is a representative parliament that is elected by, at this time in British history, the men of Great Britain. It is an industrial powerhouse. It's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and obviously they're on the forefront of industrial development in Europe. Great Britain also has massive colonial holdings in Africa and in the Far East, in South Asia. And then they've got their self-governing dominions, places that were colonies of Britain that are still a part of the British Commonwealth, like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Militarily, Britain has the largest navy in the world, kind of important when you have a empire that the sun never sets on. And they've got a small volunteer army. It's one of those things that allowed Britain to have such a massive navy, is they don't really have to spend a ton of money on building a defensive military in the continent, or to defend their borders from any continental enemies, because Britain is an island. They don't have to have a massive army to defend themselves. The next great power we're going to talk about is Germany. Germany is a relatively new country in Europe. They were unified in 1871 between a bunch of German principalities and an empire known as Prussia. And they would become the most powerful nation on the continent of Europe. They've got a large population. They are industrially modern. They've got the strongest army, the strongest land-based army, and a rapidly growing navy at this time in the early 20th century. They defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, and this unification of Germany is going to put all the other great powers on a little bit of edge. There had been a relative balance in power throughout the 19th century that had largely kept peace since the age of Napoleon and his expansion in France. And now with this new and larger and united Germany, this poses some new threats to their neighbors. As such, we're going to see some alliances form. For example, France and Russia will form an alliance with each other for fear of Germany itself. And Germany is going to join its own alliance with Austria-Hungary, known as the Dual Alliance, because they see France and Russia on their borders. Germany is a little bit late to the imperial game because they're kind of late to the nationhood game. But they do, by the early 20th century, have holdings in Africa and in East Asia. The next great power we're going to talk about is France. It's an industrialized nation. It's the second largest empire in the world behind Great Britain. France has holdings in Africa and in Southeast Asia. They, of course, as we just mentioned, were defeated by Germany, their neighbor, in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71. And this would carve some territory away from France and leave a lot of bitterness and resentment in the French nation. Their population is a bit smaller than that of Germany and Britain. They've they're not growing as rapidly. And as I mentioned, they themselves formed an alliance with Russia. Those two countries don't have much in common at all, France being one of the most liberal states in Europe, while Russia is one of the most autocratic and illiberal states in Europe. But they do form an alliance because of the threat that Germany might pose to them in the future. The Russian Empire, it's the largest of these powers by land and population, but industrially it is underdeveloped. They were the last of these countries to be greatly impacted by the Industrial Revolution. It is an autocratic government, probably the most authoritarian and autocratic government in Europe at this time, certainly. And they're being challenged by liberal movements that are pushing for more political freedom within Russia. So that's going to become a theme of this story is the political challenges that the Russian Tsar is going to be dealing with. It's also an ethnically diverse nation. It's so massive. They encompass a lot of different ethnicities and groups, and some of them don't want to be a part of the Russian Empire. That's going to also cause some strain in Russia. Austria-Hungary is the fifth of these great power nations. It is politically and militarily the weakest of these great powers, extremely ethnically diverse in Southeast Asia, with a lot of different ethnic groups wrestling for more independence from the government in Vienna, especially in the southern part of this empire as we move into what is known as the Balkan Peninsula. Austria-Hungary is going to gain some new territory from the Ottoman Empire called Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this population, or this new territory, holds a large population of Serbs, of ethnic Serbs. And the country of Serbia, just to the south of Austria-Hungary, would love to have that Serb population united with its own population. And so this ethnic strain is causing a lot of weakness within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that will directly contribute to the issues that lead us to the First World War. Now, those are the five big powers. There are some other players that you need to be familiar with. The Ottoman Empire, capital in Istanbul, or what was once Constantinople, and controlling much of the Middle East. But by the time we get to the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire has been split apart, losing much of its North African territory, losing a lot of territory in Europe. So this has been known to many in Europe, at least, as the sick man of Europe by the late 19th century. You've got great powers like Britain and Germany and Russia trying to assert more control within the Ottoman Empire, and in some cases chip away some autonomy from that empire. There are attempts at reform in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, but there are still breakaway regions and pushes from ethnic minorities, for example, the Arabs in the Middle East, to gain their own independence. Serbia, another country we already briefly mentioned, it's a relatively new country in Europe. It is a landlocked country, and that's going to become a part of our story. Just south of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this is former land that was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and now it is independent. And as we already mentioned, many of those Serb people that live outside of Serbia, for example, in neighboring Bosnia, which is now a region, by 1914, it's a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a lot of those Serbs would like to unite into what they would call a Greater Serbia. You should also be familiar with Belgium in Northern Europe. Belgium in Northern Europe, wedged right between Germany and France. This is also a relatively new country. It was just born in the 1830s. In 1839, there was a treaty agreement amongst the great powers at the time that promised protection for a neutral Belgium. So everybody would kind of look out for Belgium. That will become an important part of our story of the start of World War I. And then finally, Italy. In Southern Europe itself, like Germany, recently unified in the 1860s to become a new and independent nation. And they have their own disputes, both with France in their northwest and with the Austro-Hungarian Empire in their northeast. So some border disputes of disputed territory. Italy would join in an alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany, obviously with France being a target there, known as the Triple Alliance. And this was a mutual defense treaty that these countries agreed to look out for each other should any of them be attacked by anyone else. So if you've got that geography down, and if you've got these major players down, and if you've got these minor players also down, you should be good with what you need to know to now get us into the long-term and then short-term causes of the First World War.